Here we go. Yeah, thanks for coming to another guest talk in the Summer of Protocols guest talk series. This series is part of an 18-week program where a cohort of 34 researchers are exploring the various aspects of protocols. You can find out more at summerofprotocols.com. Today, we're talking with Kazys Varnelis about the city as a communication protocol. This will potentially be our last guest talk in the official Summer of Protocols duration. However, we will likely have some more guest talks sprinkled out throughout the fall and potentially the winter. So with that, I will pass it off to Drew to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker today.
All right. I'm really excited to introduce Kazys. I've been following Kazys's work since, I believe, 2008, so well over a decade. I discovered his blog back then, kind of in the golden age of urbanist blogging. And Kazys has introduced me to a lot of concepts that have really become valuable to me in the time since, particularly this idea of the network city and how digital technology has kind of changed the role of the city in the last decade or two. He's published several books. Personal favorite of mine is The Infrastructural City, which is about LA's infrastructure systems and how they're fundamental to how the city is structured and operates. He's taught in architecture academia for over 25 years. I think most recently at Columbia, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm really excited to see what he has to say. So take it away, Kazys.
Okay, cool. I'm not muted, right? Good. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. You all see that? All right, cool. So that's ironic. The golden age of blogging. Well, in looking back, I was looking at some images, looking for some images from older talks. And as I was going back, I found one talk on that I gave at MIT. I think it was 2008 or 2009. It was already on the death of the blog. So the blog is something that seems to die constantly, which is interesting. And somehow I managed to post about five to 10 entries a year on my blog. And that's about as much as I've kind of ever done. So it's kind of continues on. In fact, as I sent to all of you, I just posted that article. This gave me an excuse to post that article, which was sitting somewhere in a hard drive. I feel like when I get somebody commissions me to write an article, I should give it a few years before I put it up for free. So that gave me a chance to put that up there. In any case, yeah, so a couple more words about myself. Yeah, I taught for 25 years. And then with a kind of shift in academia, particularly towards a kind of more less research-oriented, more bottom line, I guess, oriented administration at Columbia, I decided, okay, that's the end, was the end for me. Well, they got rid of the entire research program at Columbia, so 7 faculty members, I think, and I were let go. And luckily, though, I'd been sort of paying attention, drinking my own Kool-Aid in terms of my writing, my thinking about the importance of economics to urbanism, and managed to become financially independent with some real estate sales. So not exactly really rich or anything, but I am able to pursue whatever I want, which quite lately has been continued work with art and technology. You can see that on my blog. But all in photography, which is a form of technology. During the last year, like a lot of other people, I've gotten involved with looking at AI image generation and other aspects of machine learning, particularly focusing on the inherent concepts of authenticity and inauthenticity in that, as well as the idea of a collective unconscious. You can see some of those results on my site if you'd like. And also I'm very into, but also I've become really obsessed with the fate of the environment and what we can do about it. So I actually wind up spending a lot of time gardening. I've spent the last month working extensively in my landscape, putting in native plants, hundreds in the last month, but thousands in the last 5 years. And I'm vice president for the Native Plant Society of New Jersey. So those are things I do now, kind of hands in the dirt things, as well as being a kind of hands-off investor, really, to be honest. Okay, here, is my one AI image of this talk, and I think it kind of fits in with a lot of. I must not touch the mouse because the mouse makes the PowerPoint move forward. The Obviously this is kind of the zeitgeist right now. I claim the first Barbenheimer image. This is like quite a while ago before the release of the movies, and now everybody tweets them, but mine was the first. And the reason I'm showing you this is because atomic war and the A-bomb is now really in everybody's mind. And so I thought, well, hey, even though I haven't seen Oppenheimer yet because I was busy working on this talk, it seemed like that might not be a bad way to go, to just do to start off with that. And I am a historian, by nature. So rather than some kind, I was telling Drew right before we started, rather than some kind of theoretical mumbo jumbo about how to design with protocols, which I might not even be really the right person to give, which is why it would be mumbo jumbo, I guess. I thought it would be good for me to go back through some concrete historical examples that may or may not be familiar of how protocols shape cities and how cities shape protocols. And that's a kind of cybernetic feedback loop. And there's, so again, back to the late 1940s, when it became, at that point, when the A-bomb developed, it became clear to planners and thinkers of all stripes that atomic destruction was a major threat to American urban centers. As soon as even before the Russians got the bomb, there was the concern that they would. And of course, when they did, that led to great concern about what the bomb would do. And that led to, and here is a Oppenheimer, another Oppenheimer moment, to, among other people, physicist Edward Teller, along with economists Jacob Marshak and Lawrence Klein, writing in 1946 in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that, quote, in an atomic war, congested cities would become death traps. And they proposed spreading the population out, creating what they would call cluster cities, spread 25 miles apart, to avoid the destruction of the bombs, as well as linear cities that would be ideally suited for transport. And there's also a certain kind of resonance with this, with our own, are we going to work in person world today, even though there isn't an atomic bomb, but there was a kind of a pandemic bomb, if you will. And in fact, as I was looking at another article on this, it mentioned that in this renewed concern about attack on cities, and I looked at the date, it was 2004, and I was, wow, this seems to be something that keeps recurring. And we'll come back to this at various points. But the point was that there was this interest in urban dispersal, and yet they qualified this. They said at the end of this, which isn't here in this article, they say nothing we can now plan as a defense for the next generation is likely to be satisfactory. There's nothing but world union. Not going to focus much on this article. Just wanted to point out this is the kind of thinking going on. Edward Teller is one of them, right? Now this article becomes a little bit more interesting to me now, and actually gets us ready for what we're going to talk about. Even a little bit more. A couple of years later, in 1950, MIT mathematician Norbert Wiener, who happens to be the major proselytizer for cybernetics, he has just completed his key book, The Human Use of Human Beings, which is kind of a screed explaining how to use cybernetics to improve human society. And he's also he was involved in World War I, World War II. He develops the concept of cybernetics while thinking about anti-aircraft guns and how they can track the cybernetic loop between the gun, the radar, the operator, and the plane in the air that's going to be shot down. And he becomes very concerned as well about the Soviet acquisition of the bomb. And together with a political scientist named Carl Deutsch and a historian of science named George de Santillana, they draft a manuscript titled Cities That Survived the Atomic Bomb. Now, these are all MIT professors. These are the smartest people around, and this is the kind of thing that they're doing. Strangely, it's never published, but what is published is this December 1950 Life magazine article. Life magazine is one of the most popular magazines in the United States, if not the most popular. Pretty much everybody gets it and reads it. I don't know what day of the week. I think it was Saturdays they're getting it. And, you know, it has these big images, these kind of photo essays, and talking about various kinds of issues, in this case, preparation for atomic war. And in this article, their bold plan is, as the image says, the sub says, is to create life belts around cities for refugees, right? These are life belts or green belts around the cities. These are intended to be populated with markets, distribution points for medical supplies and hospitals. And Life quotes the researchers who go on further in this little section here. They say that the decongestion of the city core will help aid the growing exodus to the suburbs and improve the communicational efficiency of the city. Okay, so there's this kind of cybernetic thought. This is like what I think is more interesting than just the Teller piece, which was just about the pure military planning. But there's this, actually, in fact, while I gave you the Abler piece on the city's communication system, I now realize this is possibly where Abler gets it from. I hear a lunatic cat screaming at my door. Sorry about that. If you hear horrible screams, it's just her. The city, they concluded, was a communications center. Stop that. Very sorry about this. Serving the same purpose as a nerve center in the body. It's a place where railroads, telephone, and telegraph centers come together, where ideas, information, and goods can be exchanged. Obviously, a city can only function efficiently if its means of communication are ample and well laid out. So here we have these two economists and a cyberneticist explaining that apart from their whole thesis about the city being needing to be dispersed for surviving nuclear war, there's also this key idea that the city is a communication center, and the city functions much as a kind of network. And amidst ads for Gravy Master, over here, Ever Ready, speaking of my cat, the game of Sorry, and this skin-soothing ingredient for your skin. Oh, and Bacardi, must not forget Bacardi. Life gave voice to these thinkers who conclude that this is really the betterment for the betterment of society. That this process of decentralizing and dispersing the city is going to, one, prevent nuclear destruction or atomic destruction. That's, I think, a key point. Atomic bomb, not nuclear bomb yet. This doesn't exist yet. And they also say, we've conceived, in the unpublished manuscript, Wiener writes, we've conceived of the city as a net of communications and of traffic. And he sees traffic and communication as both forms of, both sort of different aspects of the same thing. Just a second, she's going to scream if I let her in. You lunatic. And the only problem is that 2 years later, in November 1952, Edward Teller winds up testing Mike, a 10 megaton H bomb, and that's over 700 times bigger than the bomb dropped in Hiroshima. And that means that the new era of far more destructive weapons has arrived, and dispersal has met its match. The main reason for growth in the suburbs after that will simply be cheaper real estate and also profit, which is much easier on green fields than in the more expensive built-up territory of the city itself. Sorry, I thought I had her in a decent spot, but she is insane. I apologize here. Shut up. Some trees. Okay. In any case, if you follow me on Twitter, you know that this cat has quite a persona. This now gets us to this diagram, which I imagine many of you have seen, and which is, if you haven't, is a kind of a critical diagram for trying to understand sort of theories about the network, theories about the internet, and also even there's discussions of the blockchain with this. So if you visit architecture schools, it's still talked about, and has a lot to do with what we were just talking about. It's kind of within that framework, right? And really begins to get us into the idea of protocols, because I haven't quite mentioned that yet. So in this case, this is a diagram from by the engineer Paul Barron, and Barron is employed by the Rand Corporation. This is now the 1960s, right? So the idea of just simple urban dispersal isn't going to work. Just nuclear weapons, you're getting into mutually assured destruction. You're getting into a world of hundreds and then thousands of warheads on each side. You're beginning to get into a world where there is where these can be delivered no longer by bombers, but by ICBMs, and destruction can happen within a matter of about 40 minutes, as opposed to, having any kind of warning at all. And Barron is employed by the Rand Corporation. In case you're not familiar with it, it's a Cold War think tank and research institute in Santa Monica, still in existence. And Barron is tasked with figuring out communication. He's an engineer who's tasked with figuring out how to ensure communicational survival after a nuclear exchange. And that communicational survival isn't for you and me, it's for the military. And it's for the command and control of, never figured out why this thing seems to move by itself, but it does. The command and control of the military, of units in the field in a post-nuclear exchange environment, right? So that's a really extreme situation. And he, in this book, this report, rather lengthy report called On Distributed Communications, he describes 3 different kinds of networks. Centralized networks, and centralized networks are quite clearly on the left. There's a single central node that controls the entire network. It's vulnerable to the failure of that central node. If that central node is bombed out by one bomb, nobody's talking to anybody, right? The stations are all isolated. It's a disaster. The protocols involved in this, say, would be actually very, if you were thinking of this as something that had a kind of a protocol component that wasn't purely hardware, because at this point it would have still been hardware based. We're talking, radio signals, really messages, at most kind of radio telex messages. This would have been the centralized model. Would have been very simple protocols, just simple protocols of control. The middle one is decentralized. It is actually what is the dominant model at the time, because there is no central station of communications anywhere. The centralized one is kind of overly graphic. It doesn't quite exist. Decentralized has multiple hubs that for at least some of the nodes. So if you knock out this guy, this unit at least can still talk to each other. If you knock out this one, pretty much everybody except the still cluster can knock out each other, and that's fine. And the final one, however, the one that he's advocating for, is distributed. And distributed is the most robust because that has no central nodes. All nodes are equal. Each actual station is a node, and it passes on the message to the next station. Now, this involves highly complicated protocols, particularly the protocol known as packet switching, that is in use today. And this is he's one of the 2 inventors of the idea of packet switching. And packet switching, quite simply, is a protocol that, now we can move on to this, that is used, for example, in TCP/IP. Gosh, what is going on with this? I find this so frustrating. I'm never sure, I'm never touching anything and things move. TCP/IP works by simply as packet switching. It breaks protocol into packets. Those are shuffled through various routers and then reassembled into an original whole using various bytes of information that are used for error checking, that tell you how to assemble the packets. If one packet doesn't make it, you can then, there's going to be the error correction will algorithm will tell you, and then it can be reset, right? Easily enough. And in 2011, when Barron died, Wired actually said or in his obituary, Wired said he dreamed up what's become the internet's fundamental architecture. And that's essentially true in the sense that packet switching, yes, is used in the internet. It's fundamental to the internet. We're using it right now as we're talking to each other. But it's not this. It's not the distributed model, right? We still very much have a decentralized model in play. This is really a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, is the difference between distributed and decentralized, and the roles of various kinds of protocols, both, let's say, protocols that might be familiar, let's say, I don't know everything you're talking about, let's say protocols that one might more typically think about in terms of sets of instructions, right? Sets of instructions for software instructions for hardware to follow, or however you might think of it. But there also are various kinds of extremely hard hardware, if you will, that involves communication systems that is on which all of this whole stack runs. So, for example, in 2004, NYU theorist Alex Galloway wrote a book in which he kind of talked about TCP/IP as being the very thing the internet runs on. This explains everything, but it doesn't. You need to get below it. You need to get into a kind of hardware level that literally gets into a planetary scale, and that's what the rest of this talk is about, and my whole point in this is about. So let's go on to the first. We'll now go on to the two essays that I left for you. The first is Ron Abler's "What Makes Cities Important." He's a geographer. He's later on the president of the American Association of Geographers and also the International Geophysical Union. His essay is written in. By the way, I have a meeting chat shared. Nobody told me that. So it's sorry about having that there in front of you. The essay was written in 1970 for Bell Telephone magazine, and thus was lunatic. Just a second. Jen, come and get your cat. She's like being insane. Okay, that's kind of like extra special insanity on her part. So in this essay, "What Makes Cities Important," that essay is written in 1970 for Bell Telephone magazine, right? Thus, it's read internally in the corporation. It's an argument for the importance of communication. And in that, Abler sees a possible change within cities coming up due to telecoms. He asks why New York and Washington are so important. He says population size is certainly an important measure, but why are people there? And Abler sees the reason is population size. First of all, the number of people are, population size is an important measure of cities. It leads to greater and greater growth, but why are they there? And he sees that, he finds that cities themselves are communication systems, and the success of a city depends on its ability to process information, to process messages. And he does this using Bell Telephone data. He looks at the way messages are exchanged in the US, and he finds that most messages the largest number of messages goes through New York City. And that is why the city is so powerful. As he says, fortunes are made and society is managed on the basis of information and ideas. Our society cannot function without accurate and timely information. And our largest, most important cities are those which are major communications systems. So in other words, the more successful the communication system, the city as a communication system, the more successful it is as a city. And this is also happening right at the time. This image isn't accidental. This is also happening right at the time in the late 1960s that there's a huge shift in New York City away from seeing Lower Manhattan as a place for purely financial services and offices, even though that is informational, but they're beginning to think of this time with the growth of Midtown, this area is beginning to decline, and they're beginning to think that they need to have residences there and more amenities, and the waterfront needs to be nice. And there's Mayor Robert Wagner at this in the mid 1960s had commissioned the Lower Manhattan Plan to do this. Before that, I think Nelson Rockefeller had worked on this. I'm trying to get his name right. I think it was Nelson, future governor, had worked on this, trying to develop Lower Manhattan, to rethink it, to get World Trade Center in there, to do work like putting Battery Park City in, to change the idea of what Lower Manhattan was, because Lower Manhattan would remain important, but it needed to maybe lose some of the kind of the back office functions that used to be there. And so when we get to Abler and we were talking about the idea of the city as being this major nexus for information, where information is brought, messages are sent to the city. The messages at that point, typically when I say send, I'm not talking emails at this point. Quite obviously, I'm talking telephone or postal, for that matter. But these kind of, we just call them, let's call them messages for short. They could also be telegraph, of course, that in that case more textual. But in this case, what we're looking at is a kind of a historical reason. That is that the city itself, which has grown to a certain point, continues to get these kind of network scale effects of growth, simply because it is attracting more and more information to it. And New York, being the national information center, is the largest city. So this already gets us into kind of like the historical a little bit, that as Abler is also suggesting there's kind of importance to history, and also kind of obviously reminds us a little of Wiener. I'm not going to go and repeat what's in my article. If this interests you at all, you can go back and look at the architectural history of the data center that I sent you, but I'll start like towards the end of it and just kind of recap it very briefly. And then for the rest of what we're going to talk about, we'll head into kind of maybe part 2 of what would be outcome after or part 3 of what would come after that preliminary history of the data center that I sent you. So again, just in case you didn't read it, the thesis of that article is that at its most essential, the data center is a structure dedicated specifically to the transmission of information. And I want to know, where does the data center come from? Because people kept asking me, because I got to be known about someone who talked about data centers, and people were like, so where are these things from? Even people who owned them were asked, how did this emerge? So I decided I would take this upon myself and answer it. And so the data center is a structure dedicated specifically to the transmission of information, not to the storage of information. And that differentiates it from the library, because a library has these long rows of shelves, and they certainly carry a tremendous amount of information, and there is circulation. People can come in and read the books. Sometimes they can take them out. Not all libraries are lending libraries, of course. And now we do have interlibrary loan, but all of this is much slower and actually not that related to the data center. It's actually a very different model, even if it's often used as an analog to the data center. Again, many libraries don't even circulate books. And what do they actually give out, right? The first building type I was able to identify, and I think anyone will be able to identify as a data center, is in fact the post office. And in particular, its development in the US in the mid-19th century. The US uses the postal system tremendously in the late 18th and 19th century. In fact, if you read the essay, a lot of the things we associate with the federal government, that the conservatives say, why is the federal government so powerful? Why do we have all these things? It doesn't say that in the Constitution. And the way in was actually the post office. When the postal system was understood as essential for democracy, newspapers were soon subsidized to transmit information. I mean, not the actual subsidization of the newspaper, the sending of the newspaper through the mail was subsidized. That's what I meant. Were given special rates, discounted rates to be sent through the mail, so that somebody living on the frontier in Michigan could be as informed as somebody living in New York City. And in fact, that's something de Tocqueville says. He says, in fact, the frontiersman knows as much as the inhabitant of Ile-de-France, because he gets the newspaper once a week and he reads it cover to cover and he thinks about it. This is the model of Jeffersonian democracy at work, whatever you may think of it. Along with that, of course, is there has to be means of transmitting the mail from city to city. That's the National Post Road. And then that's where you begin getting the federal government getting involved in construction of roads, and eventually post offices. That takes a long time. You can read the essay to figure out how post offices emerged. But the point is that this early building type is that can be identified with data transmission is the post office. And already by 1800, it became very clear, especially with a country that even then was quite large, that there would need that point-to-point transmission wasn't going to work, right? Sure, you could send a stagecoach full of mail from Boston to New York, but how about from New York to Concord, New Hampshire? How often is that sent? Makes much more sense to send it to Boston and then on to Concord. And that's the hub and spoke network. We still have it today with the mail. And it is a fundamental model of networks, that this decentralized model, this fundamental model of networks that is actually created as far back as this building type of the post office. And at this point, you're not getting, until the Civil War, there's no home delivery. So you have to go to the post office to pick up your mail. Your mail also, until the Civil War, rarely consisted of personal mail, because that was expensive. It was not subsidized. So there would be periodicals. And the other thing that was financial material, things like bills, orders, but all sorts of other financial commercial transactions, right? And that is an essential part of this processing of this kind of information is essential. It's very much what the internet is today, right? Here in this Currier and Ives image, we have the old City Hall post office, the first dedicated post office built in Manhattan. You can look on my site to look at the kind of sorry Dutch Reformed church that had been used before that, and the whole history of reappropriating buildings for data centers and sorting facilities. And one of the things that's happening is, because of this hub and spoke system, you need to sort the mail. So the sorting happens within these buildings. These very, very large buildings are not just grandiose. There's just a kind of a small lobby, a relatively small lobby. But the real key is what happens in the back rooms, where the mail sorting for the whole city goes on, right? And as this building is being built, before even it's completed, this building here is built, and this is the Western Union building, the Telegraph building, and this whole area this is the south end of City Hall Park. When this building is torn down, I believe that area reverts back to the park. But this also abuts something called Printers Row, and Printers Row is where the newspapers are, because again, periodicals are important, and both the post office for information in, but also newspapers out is there, but also the telegraph is essential for knowledge, for the distribution of knowledge, right? So here, the Western Union building has on one of the floors, I'm forgetting which at the moment, has co-located within it the Associated Press, right? Like very, very early on, you have co-location within what really is much more of a modern data center, with the one exception being that maybe stuff really doesn't hang out here very long at all, but so it is. In any case, the other thing is that this area is this is right in lower Manhattan, right next to the financial district. Again, the importance of finance. So that's why this is there, and it becomes symbiotic, right? This Abler's thesis that New York becomes the most important city in the country because of its dominance of information. And this is cemented by a kind of symbiotic growth between information in the postal system and then the telegraph, and then they're kind of the growth together, right? And I think, in academics, kind of getting, because I fell prey to this for, I don't know, 15 years or so, there was just such an obsession with everything is capitalism. Capitalism has a motive force. Capitalism is this, that. Yeah, I suppose capital does have a certain kind of motive force, but so does information. And I think that until we understand information kind of has its own motive force, if anything does. But I mean, if you're going to use capital as a metaphor, I think you need to use information as well. And that has its own sort of own ways of operating. We're going to be behind a little bit. I think that's important as well. All right. Obviously, we get into the telegraph very quickly. This is an image from, this is the first image of the first transatlantic cable, 1866, telegraph going under the sea to the Europe. Here's something from the Telegrapher, a journal of the National Telegraphic Union. And there's a little quote from a poem, which I just put up on Twitter, an anonymous poem called The Electric Telegraph from 1851. If you thought about the Pony Express, you've heard about the Pony Express, the kind of the brave young men, on their little ponies, riding across the country to transmit mail. That lasted 1 year. And it lasts 1 year because the telegraph is laid across the country for the first time, and that's it. And goodbye ponies. And again, a few years later, you have the telegraph under the Atlantic. It's slow it's prone to breakdown, but we begin to have a planetary system of communication, right? And again, as you see here, it only exacerbates or intensifies, might be the term, existing communication. By the way, I also find it interesting how in this Courier and Ives print, this incredible, almost mad traffic situation down there. Traffic lights don't exist at this point. It makes actually traffic today look kind of peaceful, but the horse-drawn streetcars, wagons, coaches, and everything, just kind of complete chaos on the street. Really, really kind of amazing. So with all that said, then, how do we get back to, where do we go? And when we have the development of telephony, it really follows the same model the telegraphy uses, quite literally adopts it, often in the same buildings. The same buildings are taken over. And the model is a model that is a kind of decentralized model. You have a central office, and the central office tends to be right in the center of the city. In the case of Los Angeles, it is this building. It's the Madison complex, built in 1962. Then you have the company office, which I'll show you a few examples of in a minute. And then those are connected to individual phones. So you can think of a neighborhood or a small town. And then this is kind of like, if you have a phone number, this is like my phone number is 973-746-0498. So this is the 746, which at one point had a prefix. Like, remember when I was a kid growing up in Chicago, my prefix was Graceland 7. 447 was it was Graceland or something. I don't know, that doesn't make any sense. But I think it was called Graceland 7 was our 3-digit prefix. And then this would be where the area code is, okay, right? So that's those, literally you see the kind of the artifacts of those in phone numbers even to this day, especially older phone numbers that haven't changed too much. If people can call me if they want. You know what? Go ahead and call me, because actually, I don't answer that phone ever. Ever. I don't even know why I have it anymore. I think I get it for free. I'm not giving out my real phone number. But then, okay, so on back to actually looking at the way this works. So this is the Madison complex in LA. It's built in 1962. There's a microwave tower on top. It's part of something called the long line system. We'll go over the long line system in a minute, and its relationship back to the nuclear world and to atomic war. But you see how there isn't very much, the Madison complex doesn't have very many windows. That's because it doesn't need them, because it's nothing but switching machinery. It is simply machinery within that central office, and that's what's in there. The company offices, sometimes also called the central offices. It's a little peculiar, a little, kind of, I haven't quite figured out what I want, but sometimes they refer to them by different names. The company, but I call them the company offices because that's what I was told they were called. The kind of the local offices, and these are really fun to find. You just drive, as you drive around or walk around, look for them. They're somewhere, you can usually find them simply enough, even on Google, somewhere near where you live. And this is one in Great Neck, New York. These images, I poached them all from an excellent, fun website called the Central Office. Here's another one. This is in La Puente. This is the Maple Grove office, which kind of looks like a suburban house, right? Kind of, or maybe like maybe it's like for some kind of athletic facility. Here's another one in Calabasas. Since many of you, I imagine, are in upstate California. This is Marin County, and this one I just really loved is Poplarville, Mississippi. So these company offices had this whole aspect of being really stealth, right? They kind of, you weren't supposed to notice them. You weren't supposed to know they were there, but they were there. And you could tell because they obviously have no windows, and they kind of try to be a colonial brick building, but then you realize it has no windows or something's up. And to get back into sort of what goes on between these things, by the 1950s, they begin to realize that the actual links between these central offices, the hardwire links were not powerful enough. They're didn't have enough bandwidth. They also were vulnerable to various forms of attack, sabotage, even nuclear attack. And so AT&T developed something, it's the Long Lines division, developed this microwave system. And it was very much a Cold War project. They had this term, communications is the foundation or motto, communications is the foundation of democracy. I'm told that in many of these facilities, they would raise the flag and say the Pledge of Allegiance every day. You can see how the Long Line system covered the country. And what it consisted of these microwave towers, right? Often on these hills. This is in the desert, somewhere in California, I suspect. You saw the one on top of the Madison complex, right? And throughout, there's this idea of survivability. I don't know how anybody expects the Madison complex to survive an atomic war, but it doesn't necessarily matter as long as these other relay towers can communicate with each other. Although, as you see, there are definitely some places, and they tend to be associated with cities, that you could take out with a nice nuclear strike, and now not much of the country is talking to each other. Here's some images from a book published on the Long Line system, and you can see, and this kind of gets us to the problem that Barron ultimately faces, is Barron's system and the distributed network, and this is still true of the internet today, functions on leased or otherwise fixed lines. At that time, they were leased over the Long Line system, and you can see here's the U.S. Strategic Air Communications Command keeps in touch with its subordinate commands throughout the world, but it's doing it through very much a hard system that can, even if it has microwave towers, that has hubs that can be knocked out. Right now, that gives you, now thinking about this. So what I'm suggesting here, and kind of getting towards the end of this, I have just a couple of slides left, is that what we're looking at is a situation where protocols are not just something that is articulated in terms of a given set of commands, of instructions, but also there are certain kind of protocols that are inherently physical and urban, right? So there's a kind of a urban dimension to them. They may not even be written down, but like things like, for example, the way that cities grow, and the agglomeration effect of population and finance and business, and therefore information transfer. And to go a little further, I thought I should go into a couple of other things just to finish up, and bring in New York City, where there are a number of these company offices. It's kind of actually dispersed a little bit more simply because it is the most communicationally rich, dense city in the country. And you may have seen this, a very famous building. This is the AT&T Long Lines building. And in a 1917 tweet, Tom Hanks says, "This is the scariest building I've ever seen. What the fuck goes on inside?" And in fact, I was walking, because I know something about these things. I once was walking down the street in Soho, and a rather famous architecture theorist stopped me in panic and asked if it would be okay to live next to it. I said, well, your mileage may vary. You have to decide that for yourself. But this building is 33 Thomas Street. It's located in not quite all the way down in lower Manhattan, more the Tribeca area roughly. And it was built from 1969 to 1974 by the architectural firm John Call Warnecki and Associates. Warnecki thought of this as this building was designed to house the long lines, the main long lines operations of AT&T, period. Like, not just for New York City, but since New York City is the biggest informational center in the country at that time, it also is located on the northeastern seaboard. This is also the landing point and departure point for various international routes. Okay, we'll get into that in a second. The building has no windows at all. It has 29 floors with 3 basement levels. I believe each floor is actually something like 15 feet tall. They're very, very tall. They're very overbuilt for human habitation because they're housing machinery, which is much heavier than humans. Warnecki called this a skyscraper to be inhabited by machines. And his goal was to create a communication nerve center. Quote, this is a quote from Warnecki, like a 20th century fortress with spears and arrows replaced by protons and neutrons, laying quiet siege to an army of machines within. Laura Poitras wrote a article for The Intercept that has a bunch of good information on this, with I think Henry Moltke. I have it written down on the next slide. But this is a major international gateway switch, this building, and still functions this way to the day, as I understand it. And basically, as I said earlier, it routes phone calls between the US and much of the world, at least on the eastern seaboard. And that isn't just the US, but if you want to call Brazil from London, dollars to donuts, you're doing it through this building, right? It isn't, there may be a fiber optic cable going, but this might be the best way to do it. And actually, one thing that the US did, I'm not exactly sure when it started doing this, but it actually kind of artificially, or there were the rates on international calls through the US were generally, and I still believe generally still are, cheaper than any other way. So if you go through the US, let's say, again, going from Paris to Columbia or something, it's to Columbia, the country, not the university. It's cheaper that way because of this, and this is from the Poitras and Henrik Moltke, that was his name, article. I think it was about 2016, 2017. And they can't say for sure, but they identify, this is a top secret slide, but it's already on the internet, so you can find it. It was covered in the New York Times, about something called Titan Point, with an E. How cute, point with an E. Titan Point, although here it says Titan Point, but there on their website they were saying Titan Point with an E, so I don't know. Anyway, Titan Point was an NSA operation that likely is still in place, that has monitoring of anything that goes through there. And any of these big facilities are going to do this. So, there's some kind of NSA presence here, and the result is that, again, you might want to, the reason they can get access to this is because of the centralized nature of the net, right? And so again, if Barron is after this kind of decentralized system or distributed system, at best he's getting decentralized. And the internet as well. And this is, yes, 1991, but it's such a clear system of the way NSFNet such a clear map of the way NSFNet, which later on becomes the internet, operated. I think it's really useful. The U.S. military leased AT&T lines for communications. And that's why the distributed network never was built. And when the internet was built, we have the same model right here. And even if you do have a distributed system like Tor or something, it's still working on lines that are largely like this. And even Wi-Fi, or 5G, my 5G from here will go to, I can tell you exactly which building in town it goes to, and then where it goes to from there, and we could trace that really easily. So these things we don't actually have mesh. I mean, there are some mesh communication systems out there, but it is still very little used, simply because it's slower, right? So it's harder to justify. And just to finish up, because I've done a lot of work on this, when we were looking at as the growth of the internet and other communication systems, there's the Madison complex again, with now, that's a microwave tower on top. Again, exactly how that was supposed to, how that was going to manage to survive an atomic or nuclear blast when it's right in the center of the city is a little beyond me, but it was here, and there actually is various kinds of rules about where skyscrapers could be built around it to prevent blocking it. But after the breakup of AT&T in the 1980s, there began to be legal requirements. So again, a kind of protocol, right? A legal protocol in this case, that the various other telephone companies like US Sprint or for example, other companies that would have competing telephone systems would have to have access to the lines in this building, and they weren't allowed to actually have physical space there. And it turned out that One Wilshire, which was kind of a slightly down on its luck building at the time, had some vacant space and was located close enough that it was easy to run fiber optic lines between them. And that only escalated until by 2000, One Wilshire was the most connected space in North America, if not the world. And the Meet Me room on, I believe, the third floor of One Wilshire, about which I've done a tremendous amount of work, was called the most expensive space in North America, simply because that was where all of this, where internet providers of various sorts or various kinds of internet companies could interlink with each other freely. So this even begins to fall away as new forms of networking emerge. But now this happens. And of course, there's a lot of stories about One Wilshire and the NSA, CIA presence there. If you ask any of the ISPs there, they'll just tell you, that would be no surprise. In any case, you can also find more if you just Google my name and One Wilshire. I wrote a bit about it over time, but don't want to take the time today to do that. So with the last slide then, I just wanted to conclude by saying, so protocols in the context of telecommunications and the internet are sets of rules or procedures for transmitting data between electronic devices. They're the backbone of human communication. They dictate how information is formatted, transmitted, received, and processed, right? But cities also have their own protocols. They're governed by protocols. These include legal regulations, social norms, and physical infrastructure. We could talk about rail and the laws on rail and the city. We could talk about cars and traffic and highways, or now alternative forms of transportation, and the protocols around those. We could talk about protocols involving which areas of the city can house massive communications gear and which areas can't, which areas of the city can house commercial things and can't. We could go on about this for an entire course, but we're not going to because we have about a couple of minutes left. But it's a kind of a two-way street that protocols, protocols shape cities, cities shape protocols. Similarly, you could replace any of those key words, protocols and cities, with communications. Protocols shape communications, communications shape protocols, and also cities shape communications, and communications shape cities. So I think that's what I'm going to try to get to at this talk, is to think about, whatever and I have no idea what any of you are doing with your research, but whatever your research is, what other kinds of, protocols are out there, and some of these things again are very coded, like literally building codes, legal codes, and some of these emerge in physical form, the physical properties of highways, the physical properties of fiber optic lines, the fact that fiber optic lines can go by rail because rail already has right of ways and legal conditions. We've been talking about this for a while, but this kind of exchange of formal and informal protocols, I think, and trying to understand this, I think, is really crucial. And whether it's in terms of building some kind of thing in what we call the net, building something that is in the realm of, say, the Internet of Things or smart cities or something, or what have you. All right, so that's it. And I hope that was enjoyable and useful for you. I will make my screen. Oh, we've already you stopped my screen from sharing. Yes, good. Okay. Oh,
Cool. Thanks so much for that. Drew, do you want to host a little Q&A?
Yeah. As you see, because it's 1:57. I don't know if you have a hard stop at 2 or if
I have not. I can go.
Okay. Maybe we'll go a few minutes over if anyone has any questions. I'll field questions from the Discord if anyone shares there, or if anyone just wants to unmute and ask directly, that's cool too. If there's not any other question, I have one actually.
Sure.
Let me see.
Dorian and Chanel
never
both
mind.
have
You guys go
questions
first.
hand-raised.
Dorian?
Dorian?
Dorian, you want to go first?
Chanel, go first.
I'm curious, it seems like a lot of your examples of nodes and networks are relatively central or unique elements of networks, but of course, a redundant network in physical space would also involve, as a result of being redundant, a lot of duplication. So I'm curious about if you found interesting examples of duplicate physical spaces which are related to your thinking about networks.
There are some examples, a lot less than I found. I mean, not a lot less than I found. That makes no sense. A lot less than I would have thought. There's a lot of non-redundancy. There are a lot of extremely critical facilities. Had the 9/11 hijackers flown into One Wilshire, I think they would have done a lot more damage than into the Second World Trade Center, honestly, even if they would have killed a lot less people. But that said, there certainly are, and a lot of these do have to do with things like planning for massive disasters. And again, there's not, as we found during the Superstorm Sandy, the amount of redundancy was remarkably little when we lost communications around here, and a lot of Manhattan did. But, and the big but is, when it comes to, I say the most important informational transfer, communication, sets of protocols, all of that you could have today in probably, apart from military issues, is probably a stock market. And there has been, Daniel Buenza actually wrote a book about this, but I've also researched this a bit, that there are multiple redundant, there's at least one major backup facility for at least the New York Stock Exchange. That's the one of the American exchanges. That's the one I examined. I did not examine the others so much, but the New York Stock Exchange has, sure, it's got its the building on Wall Street, which is really all theater now. It's been all theater for 15 years. Really, it's primarily there to give businesses a backdrop when they, when somebody rings the bell or whatever, or launches there, or Brazil, the president of Brazil comes in and rings the bell, and that's a big moneymaker and is very popular. But the actual work, which happens without humans, which all happens with interconnects, happens in Mahwah, New Jersey, in a building that looks like a prison building. And apparently there's another one. And also similarly, and that can be brought up online, and I don't know where that is. And that building already is located in Mawa because there are multiple redundant electric networks. And even if you knocked out a large part of the highway network and cut off fuel to it, you could truck in diesel there over the highways to the generator. So it's extremely well located for that. There reputedly is another one, but also in Daniel's Buenza's book, the name of which escapes me at the moment, he talked about how there was actually he was doing his dissertation on he was doing a sociological study of a firm in the World Trade Center, and he was doing it in 2001, and he was kind of a what would you call it, a embedded observer, right? And 9/11 happens, and he's told, okay, well, go to this address in New Jersey. And there already in a warehouse is a set of desks and signs saying, like, I don't remember which floor it was, but like 71st floor, 72nd floor, 73rd floor, and everybody's desk is laid out just the way they were in the World Trade Center. So there's that kind of redundancy. And again, that is very much in a kind of informational system, and that redundancy is there to make sure that the smooth operation of the markets continues. So yeah, there is that, but also surprisingly little redundancy, surprisingly little. And I think that there still are like major potential threats, like that. I mean, if I was involved in, in government security planning, I'd still be kind of afraid, because it doesn't take much. But I think that is a good question. I think that does lead to, I think that question of how redundancies are built into those protocols is an important one, because Barron system isn't in place and it could go down, right? And now you don't need a terrorist attack. You can have a nastier hurricane than Sandy, and things will be looking pretty grim in New York City and everywhere around here. And any earthquakes on the West Coast, any of these cities are vulnerable, right? And with that, any of these informational regimes are vulnerable. Similarly, too, although Starlink has changed an awful lot, we also have the danger of transatlantic cables and other cables being cut, and that does happen from time to time, including for military purposes. Strangely, things disappear. Cables get cut outside of Egypt, in the Mediterranean, heading to Egypt, or all sorts of places.
Interesting. Thank you.
Sure. Good question. And who else had a question?
Me. Thanks, Kazys.
Hey.
So I guess what the thing that got me thinking about, I mean, aside the fact that the contribution of nuclear paranoia to suburban sprawl, or to the extent that it is, but I got thinking about how, like, have you seen those experiments with slime molds? How they kind of get slime molds to recreate the Tokyo railway system kind of thing. And
somewhere in the dim recesses of my mind, I remember seeing that like a while back. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess what's sort of interesting about that to me is that the organism kind of reclaims, its body mass along, sort of, if you see the animation of it, it kind of blankets out and then it kind of sucks it all back. And I guess I'm sort of wondering, like, given that human settlements kind of organized, a log normal, or kind of, not power law, but some kind of rank size distribution, because of these sort of, if you're standing on a sphere and going in one direction, you're going to, one or the direction or the other is going to have a sort of preferential attachment. I guess, like, a completely distributed network seems to be something that would necessarily be artificial. Like, the sort of the natural way almost seems to be the sort of decentralized over the distributed. Just because maintaining, like, if it was required that every connection had to have a triangle, like you had to connect to two other things, that seems to be like they would just, eventually drop off. Like, they would almost need to be deliberately maintained. So I was wondering if you can riff on that for a second.
Maybe not, but yeah, I don't know. I would really have to think about biology, a lot.
I guess,
I do, but the biology I think about tends, tends not to help me with that concept.
I guess,
You've raised a really interesting question, but I just may not be smart enough to answer it.
sorry. I just thinking, yeah, like it's just sort of like it seems like there's like, since the world is not uniform, then there's necessarily each node wherever you place it is not going to have a uniform characteristic to it, and like it's sort of like there's sorry.
No, yeah, and once you get that happening, you can kiss the purely distributed network goodbye. And if simply for no other reason that you begin to have so much more of an organizational, so much more of a load on, inevitably something is going to get more messages than the other. And once that gets more, I mean, you can go back to Clay Shirky's article about scale-free networks from about 20 years ago, where he anticipated what would happen with the internet by saying that 80% of the blogs will get 20% of the blogs will get 80% of the hits. Well, it's more like, not the Pareto principle of the 80-20 rule, but it's more like the 99.99 to the 0.001 rule. But basically, that kind of situation of the Pareto principle is something that without active measures seems almost inevitable. And in fact, Barron's model of the decentralized network, again, it was only meant to be in a communicational emergency, right? It was not meant to be a model for military communications on a day-to-day basis. It would not have worked. And I mean, it is interesting, actually, the current military, the US military, is a little bit more distributed than it used to be, or maybe in that you have, for example, if you have this, what's that concept called? But the kind of the total situational awareness, where you have somebody on the ground being able to communicate with somebody in an aircraft, which is in turn supposed soon will be communicating with various kinds of supersonic drones, and kind of having and maybe with aircraft carriers and with AWACS and with satellites and so forth, as opposed to actually say the Russian system, which actually literally, is actually a major problem that Russia is having today in the Ukraine. If a tank commander wants to call in an airstrike in the Ukraine, they literally have to call Moscow. And they probably will do it over Ukrainian cell phone network anyway, which is kind of ridiculous. But yeah, that kind of situation is almost inevitable. So I think there is, to some degree, a tendency within nature towards the decentralized. Yeah, absolutely. If we were to bring up Deleuze and the rhizome versus the tree, as people do, that's great. But you know what? If I think of my own biological analogy, the things that I obsess the most about, mycorrhizae, which are networks of fungi and other things, and bacteria and other things that grow underground and are essential to tree growth and other plant growth, and some plants can't grow without them. There's some plants I've been trying to establish in my property that are not, because my property was heavily landscaped in the 80s. When the house was built, they don't exist here anymore. And I'm trying to find ways of restoring them by like destroying, smashing old pieces of half-rotten wood, and then that will in turn encourage fungi growth and bacterial growth, and that will lead to a much richer soil ecology. But they require the tree. So that's the problem with the Deleuzian model, if you're familiar with it, is that the rhizome requires the tree, and the tree actually pretty much requires a rhizome as well. And they're both aspects of the same thing in a way. I mean, I'm not going, I don't, if you know the whole wood wide web thing, I don't think the trees talk to each other through the mycorrhizae. I think that's a misreading of the data, but there, yeah, we do have trees, and we had trees rather early on. We had trees in the, not trees that would be familiar to us, but things that were the size of trees as early as the Devonian, if not earlier. I don't actually remember. Was it what comes before that? It's the Carboniferous. Which one's first? But that's a while back, right? So yeah. There seems to be this natural tendency towards at least decentralization.
You just got me thinking about the graph density or the sort of topological properties of a mycorrhizal network. If that exists somewhere, that would be a really interesting paper to read.
It probably does, but I
Yeah.
think you'd have to look for that. I'm limited to like very simple botany. But yeah.
We're 10 minutes over. I don't see any other questions. So I just want to say thanks again for
Thank
the
you.
great talk. It was fascinating.
Yeah, sorry, my cat was kind of insane, but yeah, if you follow me on Twitter, you know she's a lunatic.
I think the cat subplot was a hit.
I think she was complaining that she didn't get enough love on International Cat Day, which was yesterday. Real lunatic. I didn't even know what she was doing here. She was just kind of like complaining, but she does that. So there we are. All right. I would think it was great. It was a really fun time. I hope it was useful to you all in terms of your research into protocols. I think that, again, I'm not exactly sure how you're pursuing this, but, in my mind, it would be to think of protocols as being things that, both are familiar. I guess I would say, look for things that might be unfamiliar forms of protocols. Like even in nature, what are kind of the natural limitations of in some cases you might have natural conditions that actually like biological conditions that affect our idea of protocols, but also like obviously hardware and the big hardware of the city, as well as telecommunicational systems that cover the globe. So yeah. That's my little thing. Hey, thank you all. I really enjoyed it. It was really fun.
Thank you. Yeah. Appreciate making the time.
No problem. Glad to do it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kazys. Appreciate your time, and we'll see you guys